What would you do if your own daughter stood up at the dinner table, pointed at you in front of the whole family, and shouted, "Apologize to my mother-in-law or get out of my house"? I'll never forget the look on everyone's faces as I stood up, walked across the room, and said just one sentence that changed everything. What happened next? Well, let's just say nobody at that table saw it coming, and by the end of the night, our family would never be the same. Stay with me because you won't believe how this story ends. It's Sunday dinner at my daughter Rachel's house. The kind of gathering that's supposed to be all about family, laughter, and maybe a little too much dessert. The roast is just right crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside. The kind of meal that makes you want to loosen your waistband and go back for seconds. The grandkids are running wild, weaving between the adults' legs, shrieking with laughter, and leaving a trail of toy cars and cookie crumbs in their wake. The air is filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, and for a moment, everything feels just as it should be. But you know how it goes. Family dinners can turn on a dime. One minute you're passing the mashed potatoes. The next, you're smack dab in the middle of a showdown worthy of a soap opera. And that's exactly what happened. It started with a comment enough, or so I thought. Janice, my son-in-law Tom's mother, had been holding court at the end of the table, regaling everyone with stories about her latest cruise and how her son Tom was such a good boy. Always has been. I smiled politely, nodding along. But when she made a little jab about how some people just don't understand the importance of family traditions, I couldn't help myself. I replied, well, sometimes new traditions are just what a family needs. It was meant to be lighthearted, a gentle nudge, but Janice's eyes narrowed just a bit, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered, like a storm cloud hovering just out of sight. I tried to focus on the kids, on the food, on anything but the prickly feeling crawling up my spine. But then, as we were clearing the plates, Janice let out a dramatic sigh and said, "Some people just don't know when to apologize." She didn't look at me, but she didn't have to. The message was clear as day. That's when Rachel, bless her heart, stood up. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands trembling just a little as she set down the serving spoon. She looked at me, then at Janice, then back at me. The room went quiet, so quiet you could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Even the grandkids seemed to sense something was up, their giggles fading into uncertain whispers, and then, in a voice that was louder and sharper than I'd ever heard from her, Rachel said, "Apologize to my mother-in-law or get out of my house." Let me tell you, I've been through a lot in my life. I've survived the 80s, 3 teenagers, and a perm gone so wrong I had to wear a hat for a month. I faced PTA meetings, job interviews, and the heartbreak of watching my kids grow up and leave home. But nothing quite prepares you for the moment your own child puts you on the spot like that in front of the whole family. Have you ever been there? Where everyone's eyes are glued to you, waiting to see if you'll crumble or explode. It's like being on stage, except you didn't audition for the part and you definitely don't know your lines. I could feel the fear creeping in, that old familiar flutter in my chest. The urge to defend myself, to shout back, to run out the door and never look back. But I didn't. I took a deep breath and looked around the table. Frank. My husband was staring at his plate, pretending to be fascinated by a stray pea. Tom looked like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. The grandkids were wide-eyed, sensing the drama but not quite understanding it. And Janice, well, Janice was sitting back in her chair, arms crossed, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She was sure she'd won, sure I would beg for forgiveness. Sure I would do whatever it took to keep the peace. But here's the thing. I've learned a few things over the years. I've learned that sometimes keeping the peace means standing your ground. I've learned that apologizing when you've done nothing wrong doesn't solve anything. It just teaches people they can walk all over you. And I've learned that family, for all its misanthropes and drama, it's worth fighting for, but not at the cost of your own dignity. So I didn't crumble. I didn't explode. I kept my cool even as my heart pounded in my chest. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and looked Rachel in the eye. I could see the hurt there, the confusion, the fear that maybe she was losing control of her own home, her own family. I wanted to reach out, to hug her, to tell her everything would be okay. But I knew this was a moment that called for something different. I glanced at Janice, who was still wearing that infuriating smile, and I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else bully me into submission. Not today. Not ever again. And so, with the whole family watching, I prepared to do something I'd never done before. I was about to change the script, to take control of the story, to show everyone, especially my daughter, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand tall and refuse to play along. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The real drama was yet to come. Asterisk. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in Janice's wine glass. I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I pushed my chair back and stood up, my knees only wobbling a little. I took a slow, steady breath, the kind you learn after years of holding your tongue at family gatherings, and started the walk. You know, the one across the battlefield of the dining room, past the mashed potatoes and the awkward silences, straight toward the woman who'd been waiting for this moment all evening. Janice, with her perfectly coiffed hair and that ever-present air of superiority, sat at the head of the table like she was holding court. She didn't even bother to hide her smirk, swirling her wine as if she were the queen and I was just a jester summoned for her amusement, I'll admit. For a split second, I wondered if I should just give her what she wanted. Maybe a dramatic faint right there on the rug would break the tension. Or perhaps I could grab a slice of pie and plant it squarely in her lap. Imagine the look on her face. But no, I reminded myself, this wasn't a sitcom, and I wasn't about to let her turn me into the punchline. I had something better up my sleeve, something I'd been saving for just the right moment. As I walked, I caught glimpses of the family's faces. Frank, bless him, was still staring at his plate, probably wishing he could disappear into the gravy boat. Tom looked like he was about to bolt for the door, and Rachel, my sweet, stubborn daughter, stood frozen, her eyes darting between me and Janice as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. The grandkids, sensing the grown-ups were up to something big, had gone completely still, their little faces peeking over the edge of the table, wide-eyed and silent. I reached the end of the table and stopped, standing just a few feet from Janice. She looked up at me, her lips curled into that familiar, condescending smile. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "are you ready to apologize?" I looked her straight in the eyes, refusing to flinch. I could almost hear her thoughts. She was so sure I'd cave, so certain I'd beg for forgiveness just to keep the peace. But what she didn't know was that I'd spent years learning how to stand my ground. I'd weathered storms far worse than this, raising 3 teenagers, losing loved ones, starting over more times than I could count. I'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to stop apologizing for who you are. I took a moment to steady myself, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, pressing down on all of us. For a brief, wild moment, I wondered if I should just let loose, tell Janice exactly what I thought of her meddling, her constant need to be the center of attention, her endless critiques of everything from my cooking to my parenting. But I knew that would only give her more ammunition, more reason to paint herself as the victim. Instead, I did something unexpected. I smiled. Not a forced, polite smile, but a real wanna smile that came from knowing I was finally taking control of the situation. I leaned in just a little, enough so that only she could hear me, and said, "Janice, I'm not here to play your games. I'm here because I love my family, and I won't let you turn us against each other." Her eyes widened, just a fraction, and for the first time all evening, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, stopping her before she could launch into another one of her tirades. "You see," I continued, my voice calm but firm, "I've spent too many years trying to keep the peace by staying silent. But I'm done with that. I won't apologize for things I haven't done, and I won't let you bully me into submission." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. For a moment, no one moved. Even the grandkids seemed to sense that something important had just happened. Janice's smirk faltered, her confidence slipping away like sand through her fingers. She looked around the table, searching for support, but found only silence. I straightened up, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. It was as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. I glanced at Rachel, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. Tom looked like he wanted to applaud, and even Frank managed a small, proud smile. Janice, on the other hand, was clearly rattled. She tried to recover, taking a long sip of her wine and forcing a laugh. "Well, isn't this dramatic?" she said, but her voice lacked its usual bite. I could tell she was scrambling, trying to regain control of the narrative, but it was too late. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. As I walked back to my seat, I felt lighter than I had in years. I'd faced down my biggest critic and come out stronger for it. The rest of the family watched me, their expressions a mix of surprise and newfound respect. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen, not just as a mother or a grandmother, but as a woman who knew her worth. And as I sat down, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real test was still to come, but for now, I was ready. I'd found my voice, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it away from me again. Asterisk. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. It was one of those moments where time seems to slow down, where you can almost hear your own thoughts echoing in your head. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and let a small, genuine smile curl at the corners of my mouth. I looked Janice straight in the eyes, refusing to let her see even a flicker of doubt. Then, with a calmness I didn't know I possessed, I said the one sentence I'd been holding back for years. "Janice, I'm sorry you feel the need to compete for your son's love, but I refuse to play that game." For a split second, the world seemed to stop spinning. You could have heard a pin drop. The grandkids froze mid-bite, their little mouths hanging open. Even the dog, who'd been gnawing on his favorite squeaky toy under the table, paused and looked up, as if he too sensed the gravity of the moment. The air was thick with shock, disbelief, and something else, something like relief. As if the truth had finally been spoken aloud after years of being swept under the rug. Janice's sarcastic smile faded so quickly it was almost comical. One moment she was the queen of the castle, the next she looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. Her eyes darted around the table, searching for an ally, but found only stunned silence. Rachel's jaw dropped, her face a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like pride. Tom, poor thing, suddenly found the ceiling tiles absolutely fascinating, as if counting them might somehow make him invisible. Frank, who'd been silent for most of the evening, let out a breath he'd probably been holding since the roast was served. Have you ever seen a family secret unravel right before your eyes? It's both terrifying and, I'll admit, a little bit thrilling. There's a strange power in speaking the truth, especially when it's been hiding in plain sight for so long. For years, Janice had played her game's subtle digs. Backhanded compliments, little power plays designed to keep everyone just a bit off balance. She'd always managed to keep the upper hand, to make herself the center of attention, the victim, the martyr. But in that moment, with one simple sentence, the mask slipped. Janice opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, like a fish gasping for air. "Well, I never," she finally sputtered, but the words sounded hollow even to her. She tried to muster her usual bravado, but it was clear the wind had been knocked out of her sails. The rest of the family sat frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. I could feel the tension in the room, the collective holding of breath, as if everyone was afraid to move, to speak. To break the spell, I glanced at Rachel, who was still staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. For a moment, I worried I'd gone too far, that I'd crossed some invisible line. But then she gave me the smallest of nods, a silent message that said, "Thank you." It was all the reassurance I needed. Janice, meanwhile, was clearly struggling to regain her composure. She straightened in her chair, smoothed her napkin, and tried to laugh it off. "Well, isn't this dramatic?" she said, her voice trembling just a bit. "I suppose we all have our opinions." But the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. The silence stretched on. heavy and awkward until finally Tom cleared his throat. "Mom," he said gently, "maybe we should all just take a breath." It was the first time he'd spoken up all evening, and his words seemed to break the spell. The grandkids, sensing the tension, had shifted, started whispering to each other, their voices a welcome distraction from the drama at the grown-ups table. I sat back down, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. I'd done it. I'd said the thing that needed to be said, the thing everyone else had been too afraid to voice. And while I knew there would be consequences, there always are when you shake up the status quo, I also knew I'd finally stood up for myself, for my family, for the peace we all deserved. Janice, for her part, seemed to shrink in her chair. She picked at her food, barely touching it, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the dining room walls. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, almost small. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but I knew I couldn't take back what I'd said. Some truths need to be spoken, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. As the meal wound down, the conversation slowly returned, tentative at first, then growing in warmth and laughter as the evening wore on. Rachel came over and squeezed my hand under the table, a silent thank you that meant more than words ever could. Frank gave me a proud, conspiratorial wink. And even Tom managed a grateful smile. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the evening in my mind, I realized something important. Families are messy, complicated, and sometimes downright infuriating. But they're also worth fighting for. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. Because in the end, it's not about winning or losing, it's about being honest, being real, and loving each other enough to face the hard things together. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that while the road ahead might be bumpy, we'd finally taken the first step toward healing. And that, I decided, was worth every awkward silence and every pin that dropped. Asterisk. It's remarkable how quickly the illusion of a perfect life can unravel, especially when the truth finally finds its voice. One moment, Janice was perched at the head of the table, her posture regal and her control over the family seemingly unshakable. And the next, the carefully constructed world she'd built began to crumble. The silence after my words I'd never imagined I'd say out loud hung in the air, thick and electric. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. Then, as if a dam had burst, the tension that had been simmering for years finally spilled over. Janice, always so composed, was the first to react. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, her face a storm of indignation and disbelief. "Ungrateful children," she muttered, clutching her purse to her chest as if it were a shield. "After all I've done for this family." She didn't look at anyone as she swept out of the dining room, her heels clicking sharply down the hallway, and the front door slammed behind her with a finality that seemed to shake the very walls. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. No one wants to be the cause of a family rift. But deep down, I knew this confrontation was long overdue. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to let the truth out, no matter how messy it gets. The room was still, as if everyone was waiting to see if Janice would return for one last word. But when it became clear she was gone, the atmosphere shifted. Rachel, my daughter, who had been standing stiff and uncertain, finally let out a shaky breath. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears, not of anger, but of realization. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't see it before. I let her get in my head, and I let her turn me against you." Reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly, and in that moment, I saw not just the grown woman she'd become, but the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after a nightmare, trusting me to make everything right. I squeezed her hand back, my own eyes misty. "It's okay, honey," I said softly. "We all get caught up in things sometimes. What matters is that we see it now." And just like that, the years of tension and misunderstanding between us began to dissolve. It wasn't magic and it wasn't instant, but it was real. We both knew there would be more conversations, more healing to do. But for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. Tom, My son-in-law, who had been so quiet throughout the evening, finally found his voice. He looked at Rachel, then at me, and then down at his hands, searching for the right words. "I've always felt stuck in the middle," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you both, but I never knew how to make peace between you and my mom. I just wanted everyone to get along." He looked up, his eyes tired but honest. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." I should have. I reached across the table and patted his hand. "It's not easy," I told him. "Families are complicated, but you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. We're all in this together." He smiled a little sheepishly, and I could see the relief in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't the referee. He was just part of the family, free to be himself. And then, as if on cue, Frank, good old Frank, who had been quietly observing the whole scene, stood up and walked over to the sideboard. He poured us each a generous glass of wine, handed them out with a wink, and said, "Well, I think we've all earned this tonight." The tension broke and laughter bubbled up around the table. The grandkids, sensing the shift, started giggling and chasing each other again, their joy infectious. The house, which had felt so heavy just moments before, was suddenly filled with warmth and light. We sat down together, plates of dessert in front of us, and for the first time in years we had an honest conversation. No more tiptoeing around Janice's moods. No more pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. We talked about the past, about the ways we'd hurt each other without meaning to, about the things we wanted to do differently moving forward. There were tears, yes, but there was also laughter, real, belly-deep laughter that felt like a balm on old wounds. Sometimes it takes a little courage and a lot of humor to break the cycle. I realized that night that families aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be real, messy, and full of second chances. We don't get to choose our relatives, but we do get to choose how we show up for each other. And sometimes showing up means standing your ground, even when your voice shakes. As the evening wound down and the grandkids were tucked into bed, Rachel hugged me tight. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. "For everything." I hugged her back, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. We might not have had the picture-perfect family Janice always wanted, but we had something better: honesty, forgiveness, and a willingness to start fresh. So, let me ask you, what would you have done in my shoes? Have you ever had to stand up to a Janice in your life? If you have, you know it's not easy, but it's worth it. 'Cause sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak your truth, even when it shakes the walls of your perfect life. And if you're still waiting for your moment, just remember you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life tales, laughter, and a little wisdom from women who've been there, done that, and lived to tell the tale. Here's to all of us. I'm perfect, courageous, and wonderfully real. Asterisk.